This pathologist cannot rule out if any intervening non-accidental factors contributed to or caused the death of Nolan Wells. Understand, he's saying based on the examination of the body, he cannot rule out foul play.
The independent autopsy of a Mississippi teenager found dead after a July 4th boat trip has been released. It was read by family attorney Ben Crump earlier today. 18-year-old Nolan Wells was last seen on Horn Island, where he traveled with friends for the holiday, but he never returned home. His parents, they still have one question: what happened?
There's so many people out in the public asking all of these questions, but the only question that we have is what happened to our son.
2 days after their son disappeared, a family did something most parents never have to consider. They put his body on a plane, out of state, to a doctor with no ties to Mississippi, because they didn't trust the answer they'd already been given. What that doctor found didn't settle anything. He wrote that real evidence never made it to his table. Organs. Tissue. Details a pathologist needs to say how someone died, held back by the first examiner, and never sent his way. And there was something else in his report. An area on the back of the young man's head, with no fracture and no explanation for how it got there. So the doctor wrote 3 words that are still sitting at the center of this case right now: undetermined, pending investigation. That's just the first layer of what turned an ordinary 4th of July boat trip into a case now sitting in front of the NAACP, a civil rights attorney, and soon, a grand jury. We're going to walk through exactly what's confirmed, what's still missing, and why this family had to fight this hard for a straight answer. Welcome to Case Alert HQ. Today's case, the death of Nolan Wells. This is a real, ongoing case, not a closed file. This case is still moving, and most of what happens next won't happen on camera. It'll happen in lab reports and closed-door meetings, long before it reaches the news. Subscribe now, so you see it the moment it becomes public, not days after everyone else already has. Now, let's get into it. Nolan Xavier Wells was 18 years old. He'd spent his senior year as a wide receiver for Ocean Springs High School before enrolling at Southwest Mississippi Community College, where he continued playing football. His father would later describe him simply as an elite athlete, a young man with real momentum in his life. On the morning of July 4th, Nolan set out with a group of friends for Horn Island, a barrier island off the Mississippi Gulf Coast, reachable only by boat and popular with holiday crowds. It was the kind of trip he and his friends had likely made before. Nothing about the day started as anything other than ordinary. Sometime in the afternoon, the group's boat began taking on water. A bilge pump issue, the kind of mechanical hiccup that ends plenty of boating trips early. The group made the call to head back to the mainland. Nolan didn't get on that boat. And here is where the accounts of that day stop lining up. According to attorney Ben Crump, a young woman Nolan had reportedly been talking to on the island says he told her he was heading back to the boat with his friends. But his friends say Nolan told them the opposite, that he was staying behind to talk to her. Crump has been blunt about what that means. It's a contradiction, plain and simple, 2 accounts that cannot both be true, coming from the people who were with Nolan last. Her identity hasn't been made public. Neither has a clear explanation for why 2 groups of people, each of whom spoke with Nolan in his final hours, walked away with opposite understandings of his plan to get home. It's the kind of detail that sounds small on its own, but in an investigation with this few confirmed facts, a contradiction this direct doesn't stay small for long. He never made it back either way. What happened to his phone in those final hours has become one of the more debated details in this case. According to Crump, it wasn't that Nolan left the island without his phone. His friends took it with them when their boat departed. When the device was eventually returned to the family, they discovered that messages on it had been deleted. Crump has also described a specific moment that day that investigators have been asked to look into. He says there is a video, recorded by someone in the group, that captures Nolan and another person yelling at one another aboard the boat. Crump has been direct in characterizing it as an altercation. It's a detail without a confirmed explanation yet. Nobody has said publicly what the disagreement was about, or whether it had anything to do with what happened afterward. But it's now part of the official record investigators are working through. As the day turned to evening and then to night, Nolan still hadn't made it back. For his mother, Christine Wansley, the wait eventually became something else. At midnight, she reported her son missing. That call started a search that would stretch across the following 2 days, on a remote, undeveloped island with no shelters, no facilities, and no cell service, surrounded by water that draws hundreds of holiday visitors every 4th of July. Somewhere between a contradiction nobody has resolved and his mother's midnight phone call, something happened on Horn Island that, to this day, still hasn't been fully explained. What came next would turn a missing persons case into something the entire country would end up watching. 2 days passed before there was any word. On the morning of July 6, a National Park Service ranger patrolling the northwestern tip of Horn Island found a body in the water. It matched the description of the missing teenager the entire Gulf Coast had been searching for since the night of July 4. That same day, Jackson County Sheriff John Ledbetter confirmed the identification. The search that had stretched across 2 days on a remote, undeveloped island was over. What came next was an investigation. Within hours of that confirmation, Sheriff Ledbetter spoke to CNN about where things stood. He said his detectives were already interviewing people who'd had, in his words, first-hand interactions with Nolan on the day he disappeared. And he said something else, a line that would end up shaping the public conversation around this case for weeks to come. No foul play has been identified at this time. It's worth pausing on that sentence, because in the world of death investigations, it means something very specific. It is not a conclusion. It is not a ruling. It is a preliminary read, made in the earliest hours of a case, before toxicology, before a completed autopsy, before witness statements have been fully gathered and cross-checked. Investigators use language like this constantly in the first days of any unexplained death. It reflects what has not yet been found, not what has been ruled out for good. But that distinction, however standard inside a sheriff's department, doesn't always land the same way outside of one. To a family who had just lost their 18-year-old son and had barely begun to process it, hearing an official say no foul play was identified, within hours of his body being found, felt like something closer to a verdict than a preliminary note. It felt like a door being closed before it had ever really been opened. That gap, between how investigators meant the statement and how the public heard it, is where a lot of the distrust that would come to define this case first took root. Sheriff Ledbetter's office didn't stop there. In the days that followed, his detectives began the standard process for any case like this. They asked the public for help. Specifically, they requested original, unedited photos and video taken on Horn Island on July 4, particularly anything that might show an argument, a disturbance, or Nolan himself. It was a wide net, cast deliberately, because on an island crowded with holiday visitors, investigators knew there could be footage out there that hadn't yet surfaced. Meanwhile, a separate and entirely standard piece of the process was already underway. On July 7, 1 day after Nolan's body was identified, the Mississippi State Medical Examiner's Office performed its official autopsy. This is required by law in any death that isn't clearly explained by natural causes, and it's the same process followed in unexplained deaths across the state, regardless of who the victim is. At this stage, that autopsy was simply one part of a routine, ongoing investigation. What it would eventually show, and how long it would take to become public, is a story that unfolds much later. For now, what the public had was this. A body recovered. An identification confirmed. A sheriff's department describing an active, ongoing case, but also a 5-word phrase that had already started to feel, to Nolan's family and to millions of people watching from outside Mississippi, like the story was being written before all the facts were even in. For Nolan's family, that 5-word phrase and the days of silence that followed it were not something they were willing to simply accept. Within days of the discovery, they made a decision that would begin to reshape the entire direction of this case. They retained civil rights attorney Ben Crump. Crump has built a career representing families in cases where the initial official account left more questions than answers, and from his first public statements, he made clear that this family wasn't interested in assumptions in either direction. They weren't asking anyone to presume wrongdoing. They were asking for a complete, transparent look at what happened to their son, something they felt they hadn't been given yet. That search for completeness led to an unusual and difficult decision. Rather than wait on the state's autopsy alone, the family arranged to have Nolan's body flown out of Mississippi entirely, to Washington, D.C., for a second, independent examination. It meant delaying part of their own grieving process, and reopening a wound that had barely had time to form, in the name of getting an answer they could trust completely. The pathologist they chose for that exam was Dr. Roger A. Mitchell, Jr., the former chief medical examiner for Washington, D.C., and the current president of the National Medical Association. He had no connection to Mississippi, no relationship with anyone involved in the case, and nothing to gain either way. His job was simply to examine what remained of the evidence and report exactly what it could and couldn't support. The cost of an independent, out-of-state forensic examination is not small, and covering it fell to people outside the family as well. Reporting has indicated the exam was funded in part by former NFL quarterback Colin Kaepernick, who has previously supported other families pursuing independent investigations into a loved one's death. By the time all of this was arranged, less than a week had passed since Nolan disappeared. For a family already trying to plan a funeral, it was an extraordinary amount to carry at once. And Crump, describing the family's mindset at the time, put it plainly. "So many things," he said, "don't pass the smell test here." It's a blunt line, but it captures something real about where this case stood in its second week. Not a family chasing a predetermined outcome. A family who felt that too many small details, the phone, the deleted messages, the video, the 5-word statement, had lined up in a way that made waiting on one official account feel like a risk they weren't willing to take. What Dr. Mitchell would eventually find, once he completed his own independent exam, is where this case would take its next major turn. And it's a turn that raised as many new questions as it answered. For now, what mattered most was this. A family who could have waited on official channels chose not to. They spent money they may not have had to spare, delayed their own grieving, and brought in an expert with no stake in the outcome, all in pursuit of one thing. A complete answer, not a fast one. What that expert found is next. If you've made it this far, this case has already pulled you in further than most. If you're still watching, drop a comment that just says, "I'm still here." Let's see how many of you are actually following this as closely as we are, because what comes next, the results of that second autopsy, is the part this entire case has been building toward. While the family waited for word on that independent exam, this case was no longer staying contained to the Mississippi Gulf Coast. On July 20th, 16 days after Nolan disappeared, his family gathered at Center Point Church in Ocean Springs to say goodbye. The Reverend Al Sharpton delivered the eulogy. Before the service ended, he made an announcement that extended well beyond the church walls. He was putting up $100,000 of his own money as a reward for anyone who could bring forward new information about what happened to Nolan in his final hours. It was a striking moment, a public figure attaching real financial weight to the idea that someone out there knew more than they'd said. And it signaled something else, too. This was no longer just a local story. That national attention had already been building. The week prior, the NAACP's National Board passed a formal resolution urging law enforcement, including the Department of Justice, to get more directly involved. At the organization's national convention in Chicago, President and CEO Derek Johnson addressed the case head-on, and didn't soften it. He said the NAACP was accusing investigators of being derelict in their duties to follow up and ensure a proper investigation, regardless of what actually happened. It was a specific charge, aimed at the process, not at any individual on that boat or island. Johnson was careful to draw that line elsewhere in the same appearance, making clear the NAACP wasn't accusing anyone of anything beyond the state of Mississippi and local officials. Still, derelict in their duties is not a soft phrase, and it marked one of the most direct public accusations leveled at Jackson County officials since this case began. Race had been part of this story's national conversation from very early on, and it's worth saying plainly, without overstating it. Nolan was the only black person in the group of friends he traveled with that day, in a state with a long and documented history of unequal investigations into black deaths. That context is part of why this case drew the attention it did. At the same time, no evidence has emerged, to date, that race played a direct role in what actually happened to Nolan on Horn Island. Both of those things are true at once, and neither cancels the other out. As national commentators began weighing in, one voice raised a question that had nothing to do with race, and everything to do with basic logistics. Crime scene analyst Cheryl McCullum, on News Nation, pointed out how strange it was that Nolan could vanish in plain sight. Horn Island on the 4th of July draws hundreds of visitors, and by most accounts, Nolan hadn't wandered off alone. He'd reportedly moved from one group of friends he knew to another he also knew. McCullum's question was simple. With that many people around, how did nobody see what happened to him next? It's a question that hasn't been answered. But it's exactly the kind of detail that turns a local tragedy into a national mystery, one that seems small on its own but sits at the center of everything still unexplained about that day. By the time Nolan was laid to rest, this case had become far bigger than a missing persons report out of coastal Mississippi. It had a civil rights organization publicly accusing local officials of dereliction, a six-figure reward attached to it, and millions of people asking the same basic question his own mother had been asking since the beginning. What actually happened to her son? And in just a few days, part of that answer, or at least part of what an independent doctor could determine, was about to become public. On July 22, at the NAACP's National Convention in Chicago, Ben Crump stood before reporters to share what Dr. Mitchell's independent autopsy had found. It had been 12 days since the exam itself took place, and the family had waited for those results the same way the rest of the country had. Now, finally, there was something concrete on the table. Crump read directly from the report. Cause and manner of death, undetermined, pending investigation. He also noted the autopsy did not find evidence of wrongdoing, even as it couldn't rule non-accidental factors out either. Two different statements, and Crump didn't blur them together. The report explained exactly why a definitive answer hadn't been possible. The first issue was access. Dr. Mitchell wrote that he never received Nolan's internal neck structures, including his trachea, or the tissue needed to directly examine the airway, lungs, and stomach contents. That evidence had been retained by the original examiner during the state's autopsy, and simply never made it to Washington. Mitchell said he didn't know why it had been kept back, though he noted this kind of retention isn't unusual when an initial examiner wants to run further testing on possible fractures or neck compression. Still, its absence meant an entire category of evidence, the kind that could help determine whether drowning played a role, was never available to him at all. There was a second factor limiting what Mitchell could determine, separate from the missing tissue. By the time his examination took place, the body had already begun the natural process of decomposition, which independently narrows what any pathologist, however experienced, can conclusively determine from an exam. It's a limitation that has nothing to do with anyone withholding evidence, and everything to do with the simple passage of time. And then there was the finding that would end up drawing the most attention. Mitchell's report noted red discoloration in the soft tissue at the back of Nolan's head. There was no fracture beneath it. Mitchell couldn't say what caused it, only that it was significant enough to flag for further investigation. Outside experts, brought in by various news organizations to weigh in, didn't agree on what it meant. Dr. Kendall Von Crowns, chief medical examiner for Tarrant County, Texas, with no direct involvement in the case, said the discoloration could represent decompositional changes, or it could result from blunt force. A third expert, Dr. Victor Whedon, a forensic sciences professor at George Washington University, raised another possibility: lividity, the natural pooling of blood after death, which depends on the body's position when found. Based on the finding alone, there was no way to determine which explanation was correct. Not every expert who reviewed the findings saw them as significant at all. Forensic pathologist Michael Baden, offering his own assessment separately, said the report didn't support any theory involving a cover-up, and suggested Mitchell was reaching for a conclusion the evidence in front of him didn't actually back up. 3 credentialed experts, looking at the same undetermined result, and landing in 3 different places. That disagreement isn't a flaw in the reporting of this case. It's an accurate reflection of where the evidence itself currently stands. The state side of this equation had a response, too. On the same day Crump announced the independent findings, the Mississippi State Medical Examiner's Office issued its own public statement. Their autopsy, they said, was performed in accordance with the standard procedures and protocols followed for all autopsies, and they said they would not be commenting further on the independent report. Their statement also included a direct appeal to the public. They understood the interest in this case, they said, but urged everyone to remain patient and avoid drawing conclusions before the investigation was complete, adding that unfounded speculation only creates unnecessary obstacles during an active investigation. It's a notable moment in this case for a specific reason. Up to this point, most of the public narrative had come from the family's side, through Crump and through the family's own public statements. This was the state offering its own voice, defending its process without directly engaging the specifics of what Mitchell's exam had found. So, after 12 days of waiting, here is exactly where the evidence stood. One independent doctor, working with limited access and a body already affected by time, who acknowledged no evidence of wrongdoing while still being unable to rule out an accident, or something else entirely. A second unexplained finding on the back of Nolan's head that 3 separate experts read in 3 different ways. And a state medical examiner's office standing by its own process, while its own findings, including toxicology, remained entirely unreleased. Undetermined wasn't the ending anyone wanted. But for the first time since July 6, it was an answer based on an actual, documented examination, not a preliminary statement made within hours of a body being found. So where does all of this actually leave the case, right now, as it stands today? Start with what's still missing. The state's own autopsy, the one performed back on July 7 by the Mississippi State Medical Examiner's Office, still has not been made public. Neither has its toxicology report. And that's not unusual on its own. Toxicology testing routinely takes several weeks to complete, sometimes longer, and it's considered a standard part of any unexplained death investigation. But it does mean that, for now, both the state's findings and the deeper answers they might contain remain entirely out of public view. It's worth putting that timeline in context. CNN law enforcement analyst Charles Ramsey, who previously led both the Philadelphia and Washington, D.C. police departments, has said that nothing about the pace of this investigation is particularly unusual, aside from the intense public attention on it. Gathering enough evidence and interviews to determine a cause of death commonly takes a week or longer, he said, even though that stretch of time can feel unbearable to a family waiting for answers. On July 15, 11 days after Nolan disappeared, his parents sat down for the first time with Jackson County District Attorney Angel Myers McElrath. According to those close to the meeting, the family didn't walk away with any major new information about the investigation itself. But one concrete agreement did come out of it. Both sides agreed to a joint, independently supervised inspection of Nolan's phone, the same phone his friends had taken from the island, and the same one his family later found with messages deleted. Experts retained separately by each side would examine the device together, rather than either side working from it alone. Then, just one day before this video was recorded, District Attorney McElrath addressed the case publicly herself for the first time in more than a week. She used the moment to respond directly to accusations from Crump that the investigation had been handled with bias. She rejected that characterization. And she confirmed something that shapes exactly what happens next in this case. Rather than releasing findings piece by piece as they come in, her office intends to present the full investigation, once complete, to a grand jury. That single decision explains a lot about why this case may feel, to anyone following it closely, like it's moving in fits and starts. A grand jury process is designed to review evidence privately before anything becomes public record. It's a standard legal mechanism for deaths like this one, not a sign of anything being hidden. It also means the timeline from here isn't entirely in the public's hands. Once prosecutors decide the investigation is complete, the grand jury reviews everything at once, and only then does the public typically learn what was found, including whatever the toxicology results ultimately show. Behind the scenes, the investigation itself has continued to move. As of the most recent public update, Jackson County investigators have interviewed roughly 60 witnesses. The FBI has been brought in to assist with reviewing digital evidence, an effort that includes the phone, along with photos and videos gathered from the public. And the 3 friends who were with Nolan on the boat that day have each been interviewed in depth. It's worth being clear about what that last detail does and doesn't mean. None of those 3 friends have been named as suspects. None have been charged with anything. In an investigation like this one, interviewing the people closest to the person who died, in detail and more than once if necessary, is standard procedure, not an accusation. It's simply where investigators start, and it's the same approach that would be taken in any similarly unexplained death, regardless of who was involved. So here is the honest picture of where things stand. An active investigation, still gathering evidence, at a pace analysts say isn't out of the ordinary. A state autopsy and toxicology report still withheld. A grand jury waiting to review everything once it's complete. And a family still waiting for the one answer they've been asking for since the very first night. What's left now is the part of this story that ties everything together, and it's where we turn next. So, stripped down to what's actually known, here's where this case sits. An 18-year-old went out on the water on the 4th of July and never made it home. His friends left the island without him. His phone left with them, and came back with messages missing. A sheriff's office called it no foul play within hours, before an autopsy, before toxicology, before the investigation had barely begun. A family, unwilling to accept that as the final word, sent their son's body across the country for a second opinion, one that came back just as uncertain, though for very different reasons. And a state that, to this day, still hasn't shown its own work. That's not a satisfying place to leave a story. It's also the honest one. Nothing here has been proven. Nothing has been ruled out either. What exists right now is a young man's death that the people responsible for explaining it still can't fully explain, and a family that has spent 7 weeks demanding the same basic thing anyone would want for their own child. A real answer, not a fast one. This is not the end of Nolan Wells' case. Toxicology results haven't been released. A grand jury hasn't met. And the questions that mattered on July 6, why he stayed behind, what happened to his phone, what that mark on the back of his head actually was, are still the same questions that matter today. We told you at the start of this video that this case is still moving. It is. And when it moves again, whether that's toxicology becoming public, or a grand jury reaching a decision, we'll be back with exactly what changed, without getting ahead of the evidence. If this case matters to you the way it's mattered to us, subscribe right now. We'll be back the moment anything real changes, toxicology results, a grand jury decision, anything confirmed. No filler, no speculation. Just what's actually known, the moment it's known.